For those who don't know Mark Bray, he is a political organizer, historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe. He earned his BA in philosophy from Wesleyan University in 2005 and his PhD in history from Rutgers in 2016. He is the author of several books, including Antifa and Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, where he was heavily involved as an organizer and spokesperson in the Occupy Wall Street movement. We are here tonight. Mark's going to be talking about Anarchist Education in the Modern School, which is the Francisco Ferrer reader. So we're going to learn a little bit about that tonight. He'll be reading some, and after he will be answering some questions. So yeah, let's welcome Mark.
Hi everyone, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming out. Christian mentioned the book I wrote about anti-fascism, and with all of the bombs being sent to politicians today, the kind of question of the threat of the far right, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that there's a connection there, is unfortunately very evident. But although there are some connections that can be drawn between that and this topic, we're going back in time to a time before, at least officially speaking, there was no fascism. So fascism will not explicitly be part of this conversation, which I'm relieved about after having talked about it incessantly for a year. I'm going to talk about this book today. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that most people don't know who Francisco Ferrer was, don't know what the modern school was, or why there's a book about it. So we're going to work from that assumption. Francisco Ferrer, let's start at the end. Francisco Ferrer was executed by firing squad this month 109 years ago, October 13th, 1909, in the moat surrounding Montjuïc Castle. If any of you have been to Barcelona, it's the castle overlooking the city. He was accused of being the mastermind of a really intense uprising against conscription for a war in Morocco in 1909. He was accused of being this political mastermind. But his defenders say, no, he wasn't killed for doing that. He had nothing to do with that. They say he was killed for starting an elementary school. So there's a big difference between being the mastermind of an uprising and opening an elementary school. So why would he have been killed for an elementary school? Well, maybe he wasn't killed just for opening an elementary school. Maybe there was more to that. Maybe, as some of his welcome their seats. Maybe, as some of his critics said, he actually was a conspirator. So Francisco Ferrer is a complicated, interesting figure. Yes, he opened an elementary school called the Modern School, or La Escuela Moderna, in 1901 in Barcelona. It was an unorthodox school in the context, of course, 1901 in Barcelona. Most education in Spain was run by the Catholic Church. It was usually segregated by sex. It was very disciplinary and very religious. The school that he opened was based on science and rationality. It was coeducational. Over time, it came to reject discipline and I was going to say discipline and punish, but that would take us in a different direction. But basically, yeah, reject discipline and punish, at least in a formal sense. Reject grades, reject punishments for students. That, of course, is very threatening to the Spanish monarchy. But there's another side of Ferrer. He was a revolutionary. He was a conspirator. So tonight I'm going to talk through a few things. One, who was this guy, Francisco Ferrer? To what extent was he actually involved in plots against the Spanish monarchy? To what extent was he targeted for opening a school? What was the deal with this school? Why is it important to understand this school? Why did Ferrer's execution spark mass movements around North America, South America, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, with protests in Iran, protests in Argentina over the execution of this school teacher? And why did it spark what was called the modern school movement, where schools based on this school were opened around the world, from China and Japan to Poland to a lot of places? So it's an interesting history that was forgotten. A bunch of them actually opened up in the US. The longest lasting was in New Jersey. So let's go back to the beginning, talk through Ferrer, his history, who he was, where he came from, to get a better sense. So Ferrer was born in 1859 in a small town in Catalonia outside of Barcelona. He only was formally educated until the age of 13. He went to really traditional disciplinary schools where he didn't learn a lot. He was basically punished all the time, and he hated it. His early political life, he was involved in the Republican movement. Now, Republican, not in the sense that we think of Republican today as being a right-wing movement, but simply in a literal sense of the movement pushing for a republic in Spain instead of a monarchy. So, Spain had a monarchy. Some of you may know a little about the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was a conflict between Francisco Franco and the Second Spanish Republic from 1936 to 1939. Well, if there's a Second Spanish Republic, there must have been a First Spanish Republic. Figures, right? And that occurred from 1873 to 1874. But then it got brutally suppressed, and the monarchy came back. So Francisco Ferrer, as a young guy, was involved in all of these Republican conspiracies to overthrow the monarchy and bring in a republic. In that time, Republicans were basically focused on trying to win friends in the military and get the military to do it for them. So one of the main figures involved in these plots was a guy named Manuel Ruiz Zorrilla, who went into exile in Paris. So Ferrer's early political job was as Zorrilla's courier to transport information between Spain and France. So if you want to be a courier, how do you do it before the age of Twitter and WhatsApp and Signal? If they're around today, they'd probably be using Signal or an encrypted messaging app, but they didn't have that back then. He got a job working for the trains. So very innocuously, he could get on the train, go back and forth. While he was on the train in 1880, he saw a young woman who caught his eye. He came over to her. She was crying. He wanted to know, why are you crying? And she explained that she was basically turned into a servant by her father and brother. She couldn't stand the domestic servitude, and she wanted to flee to go join a convent. So a big part of this story is about the Catholic Church and religion and secularism. Ferrer, being a Republican, was very anti-church. He believed in what he thought of as science and rationality. And so there was a dominant trope in 19th century left culture about essentially women who joined the clergy being coerced and forced and essentially captured. And so he saw his role as saving the quote-unquote damsel in distress from the clutches of the evil priests. So he came to her, convinced her, don't go to the convent, come with me. She did. They got married like a few months later, and they lived together in Barcelona. Her name was Teresa. Things didn't go too well for Francisco and Teresa, and if this sounds mildly gossipy, it is, but I think it bears upon the history enough, and it's, it's juicy. Teresa and Francisco lived in Barcelona. They ended up having 7 children, although only 3 survived to adulthood. The marriage didn't go so well, though. There's spaces here, there's spaces there. Come on down. Okay. The marriage didn't go so well for a couple of reasons. One, Teresa wanted Francisco to spend his time working his way up the train company, whereas he was spending his time reading French books to and from, learning French, and being a Republican conspirator. She hated the politics, and she also hated that he became a Freemason. So Freemasonry was a big part of revolutionary radical politics in the 19th century and early 20th century, and was an interesting way that anarchists and Republicans and radicals and socialists networked and collaborated. So she hated that. He had their daughters go through a Masonic adoption ceremony, and so over time, he started staying out later and later. She essentially ended up in the domestic servitude that she had escaped. It ended up pretty bad. So Ferrer escapes to France in 1885, leaves his wife and children behind, and opens up a restaurant. After a while, they eventually reconcile. The family joins him in France, but things don't go too much better because he sends their daughters to go live with his brother in Australia, which sounds pretty harsh. But if you read the accounts from his daughters, they say that they really didn't get along with their mother and they wanted to live in Australia. It's a mess. The family situation's a mess. But it culminates in a situation where Teresa confronts Francisco on the street and shoots him. The bullet only kind of grazes him. It ends up not being too much of a big deal, but that's the end of Francisco and Teresa. While Francisco's living in Paris, he gets a first-hand view of the French Republic. So again, he's a Republican living in monarchist Spain. His ideal is a republic. France has a republic. He goes to France, he thinks, hooray, now I can see this wonderful republic up close. He's not impressed. He's not impressed for a variety of reasons, mostly because there still is capitalist stratification, there still is significant poverty, and he comes to really hate the schools they have there. He describes how they essentially, from his perspective, replaced God with the state. And so the piety of the people became about the French Republic. So he ends up gravitating towards anarchism. He gives up his restaurant and he starts teaching Spanish lessons at the local Masonic temple. He also, on the side, to make some money, teaches some rich clients, including a woman named Ernestine Meunier. Initially, Ernestine is really conservative, but over time, as Francisco described it, he conquered the fortress of her superstitions in a really kind of, masculine framing, that he won her over to be more progressive. Many of the debates they had occurred during the context of the Dreyfus Affair, which some of you may know was the case of the wrongfully accused Jewish Captain Dreyfus, who was claimed was a traitor to France. Really wasn't. But this kind of divided left and right in France. And Francisco Ferrer was a very ardent Dreyfusard. He convinced Ernestine of the justice of his cause. Over time, she becomes kind of a leftist, and they decide, hey, you have all this money, let's use it for something good. Why don't you leave it to me in my will, Francisco says, so that I can open a rationalist scientific school in Spain. I can teach the youth of Spain to get rid of all of their religious superstition and so forth. She agrees. She said sure. She leaves him much of her fortune, which is really just a single building in Paris. And then she dies within like a year later, which is super mysterious and weird. I'm not saying that anything happened there, but it is kind of a coincidence when you read this history. Oh, that was convenient. Anyway, moving on. She dies. He gets all this money. He opens the modern school in 1901. Let's talk about the school. So, as I mentioned, Ferrer, his formal education ended at the age of 13. He was an autodidact. He taught himself a lot. And he admitted that he didn't know a lot about education. He wasn't trained in the ways of education. So he did what one would do. He sought the advice of his friends and comrades who had experience in schools, had studied and written about pedagogy. And he, developed a staff of teachers. He got a bunch of textbooks and put together the modern school. Years later, he would write a book about the modern school where he would describe some of its key principles. What's interesting is that if you actually look at the documents about the school when it opened, it was much less egalitarian than he would write about it being years later. So initially it did have grades. Not only did it have grades, but it published the grades in the school newspaper and would describe the behavior of the kids, sometimes in super harsh terms like so-and-so is lazy, so-and-so doesn't apply themselves, which gives you some insight into sort of the way that the public and the private were thought of in terms of children and education. They would also publish which students had been late. If they were late too often, they couldn't come on the field trips on the Sundays. So there was a pretty standard, at least by our vantage point, amount of discipline. The schedule was very much a routine. So you can see in the book, if you check it out, from 9 to 10, reading, 10 to 11, math, etc., etc. And what's interesting is that Ferrer was initially much less interested in educational form than he was in content. So I think today if people think about anarchist education, the thought is very much like letting students sort of dictate the content of their own education, student-centered, no kind of coercion, let them do what they want. He was less interested in the educational process than he was in the content that was to be learned. For him, he would talk about eradicating error, replacing it with what he called science and rationality and truth. Now, this is because he, like, most Europeans of this era, had this very optimistic faith in capital T truth, rationality, science, through the Enlightenment project, positivism, and so forth. And he believed that essentially the entire political project of emancipating the world could be boiled down to sort of almost like in a surgical procedure, taking all of the untruth out of people's heads, throwing it in the garbage, and replacing it with the truth. Which sounds very naive to us now, but I'm sure that if we had been alive back then in his same time and place, we probably would have thought the same thing, right? But I digress. That's history for you. Anyway, that was sort of how he saw truth and change in education. But over time, the modern school did get rid of grades. They did get rid of attendance in that way, and they did become sort of more egalitarian. The school opened in 1901. Oh, the other thing to add before is the kind of role of anarchism. So Francisco Ferrer, by this point, was a convinced anarchist, but he didn't call himself an anarchist in public. He didn't call the school the anarchist school for obvious reasons. It would have been shut down. But in correspondence he had with his friends, he said the school must be internally libertarian. And as an aside, the term libertarian for most of history was basically a synonym for anarchism and still is in many languages. In the mid-20th century, free market right-wingers co-opted it in the way that it's understood now. So he said the school should be internally libertarian without broadcasting it externally. So in his public writings, he rejected all political perspectives. He was only about rationality and truth. But he used the money he got from Ernestine Munier not only to open the school, but also to do a bunch of other stuff. So one of them was funding a newspaper called The General Strike. At this point, the idea of the General Strike, revolutionary syndicalism, became much more popular. A few years later, you have the IWW created in the United States, and so forth. And so in the General Strike newspaper, he would publish under a pseudonym, Zero. Zero was his pseudonym. That was also his Masonic name, so he would use that. And under that name, he would write about the need for essentially taking up pitchforks to wage the revolution. He had an article which is reproduced in my book called "Will There Be Blood?" ? Yes, a lot. So you can't get more explicit than that. So he was very much in favor of worker struggles, but worker struggles primarily for the purpose of creating revolutionary situations. He was not especially interested in sort of painstaking building of working class power over the course of decades. But at the time, you could see why he thought that. For example, in 1902, there was a really huge general strike in Barcelona, the biggest Europe had ever seen or had seen in 10 years. There was this one in Belgium for universal suffrage, but it wasn't really the same thing. Yada, yada. It was really big. Like 100,000 workers came out, and it turned into sort of a small-scale insurrection with authorities. Ferrer argued that it failed because workers didn't sufficiently turn it into a revolutionary situation. Anyway, so Ferrer donates a bunch of money to this radical labor newspaper. He creates the modern school, and he develops this sort of public-private dichotomy between his insurrectionary inclinations and his educational aspirations. In his mind, this wasn't at all a contrast or a conflict or a contradiction, because he saw there being multiple routes towards eliminating error in the world, eliminating authoritarianism in the world. It was more of a practical, strategic decision not to have them sort of in the same basket. He also hadn't fully given up his interest in conspiracies. You know, what you're into when you're young sometimes sticks with you throughout your life. And so there's minor evidence to suggest that he was involved in a conspiracy to kill the King of Spain and the President of France in 1904. He exchanged some telegrams with some of those who were accused of doing it, saying, oh yeah, the king's going to arrive on this day, so that's a good day. Again, not definitive, raises the question. Some historians are confident that he was involved in that. A year later, a similar thing happens. So the modern school had a publishing house that published radical educational books, and the fella in charge of running it was a guy named Mateo Moral. In 1906, Mateo Moral journeyed from Barcelona to Madrid for the royal wedding of Alfonso XIII to a British princess. They get married in the church, they get in their royal carriage, and they go through this elaborate procession through the streets of Madrid, culminating in the royal palace. Mateo Moral rents a room on the 4th floor, I think, of a house on Calle Mayor, Madrid, overlooking the street, and he asks the woman who runs the hotel to bring him fresh flowers every day. A strange request, but why not if he's going to pay for it? She brings him the flowers every day, and essentially when the royal procession passes in front of his building, Morale throws flowers onto the royal procession. Inside the flowers is a bomb that explodes right near the royal procession. It gives the whole Banksy mural a different kind of feel, at least for me. Anyway, if I had images in front of me, I'd show you, but there was a 19-year-old kid who had just bought a camera, his first camera, who was really into photography, showed up to take pictures of the king, and happened by chance to have taken a picture of the moment the bomb exploded, which is the first photograph of a quote-unquote terrorist attack at the moment it's occurred in history. That this kid, and he sold it to all the newspapers, and he must have been really feeling pretty good about himself. The bomb did not injure the king or queen. It killed some police and some bystanders. Morale, in the chaos, escaped. He attempted to flee. He goes to the house of this local Republican journalist named Jose Nakins. Coincidentally, Jose Nakins had received a very large check in the mail from Francisco Ferrer a few days earlier without much of an explanation. And when Morale arrives, he says, "Good thing you know Francisco Ferrer." He stays with Nakins for a while. Morale continues outwards into the outer lying areas of Madrid, but his plan has a significant problem. He's Catalan. Everywhere he goes in Castilla, everyone's like, who the hell is this Catalan? Where is he going? And essentially, after a while, the police catch up to him. Morale shoots and kills the police officer and then kills himself. The end of that. Or it would be the end of that if the authorities didn't accuse Francisco Ferrer as being one of the conspirators. So Ferrer was arrested in 1906. The modern school is shut down, never to reopen, and he's on trial. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that Ferrer was involved in the conspiracy. Some of the evidence is in the book. I think personally he was involved in the conspiracy, but there's no definitive evidence. He's acquitted, though, eventually. Some people cite his Masonic connections as being influential, knowing people in high places, but also there was a very significant protest campaign in Spain, France, and other countries to get him out. After he's out, he goes into exile, essentially, for the most part, in France and England. He writes a book called The Modern School. The entire text of the book, translated in English for the first time in its entirety, is in that book, where he lays out his educational vision. What's interesting, though, is a lot of scholars of Ferrer in the Modern School have assumed that the way that he wrote about education was exactly the way that the school he created always was, and it wasn't. So in the book, I also have excerpts of these kids' grades, all the nasty things that were said about them, the school schedule, and articles written by teachers and other people about education. So he writes this book, and while he's in England, he's looking for books written in English to translate into Spanish to bring back home when his sister-in-law and niece get sick back in Catalonia. So he comes back to Barcelona and happens to be around at the time of what is known as the Tragic Week. What was the Tragic Week? Well, basically, in late July of 1909, there's an anti-colonial rebellion in Morocco. Morocco at the time was split between Spanish and French control, and in the Spanish zone there was an anti-colonial rebellion, and so, as the Spanish monarchy would do, they conscripted a whole bunch of working class people to go over and fight this rebellion. At the time, if you were rich, you could simply buy your way out of fighting in wars. So it was very explicitly a class dynamic. So a bunch of these soldiers are ready to disembark in Barcelona, and a bunch of rich women show up giving the soldiers little medals as they get on the boat. The soldiers had had enough. They start throwing the medals in the water and shouting, "Let the rich go, let the rich go, we're not going." The Labor Federation at the time calls a general strike, and within a couple days, people are at the barricades. And what makes this rebellion one of the more strange and memorable in history is what happens next. Basically what happens is a lot of the rebels go around to the churches and convents. They loot the churches and convents, they set the churches and convents on fire, and they often dig up the bodies of buried nuns and priests. Now, why would they do that? I see your look of horror, understandably so. This has a lot to do with what we were talking about earlier. The anti-clericalism of the time was based on these long-running stories about how women had been essentially kidnapped, forced to be nuns, and were tortured. So the idea was by digging up their bodies, they could find evidence of torture to prove once and for all that the Catholic Church was essentially a torture dungeon. Related to that also, of course, was just a kind of idea of defamation against the institution that arguably had the most authority in society. So you have a situation where there's a general strike. There are, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 convents and churches on fire. I think in the book I include an aerial shot of Barcelona with just smoke coming up everywhere. People are marching these bodies of the clergy through the streets of Barcelona, sometimes depositing them at the houses of politicians. And there are armed barricades in the working class neighborhoods. This lasts for about a week. At the end of the week, Francisco Ferrer is charged as the mastermind of the rebellion. No, he was not at all the mastermind of the rebellion. There's ample evidence to show that there was no mastermind of the rebellion, and if there were, he wouldn't have been it. But ironically, he wished he could have been the mastermind of the rebellion, because he spent this week going around to the leaders of all the different political factions, trying to give them advice, trying to tell them how he thinks they should move forward, and for the most part, they just ignored him or tried to avoid him. For a few reasons. One, because he was already sort of a little too hot after his earlier arrest. No one wanted to be seen with him. Second, because he actually occupied kind of an in-between space in the world of radical leftism. He was largely distrusted by the workers' movement because he was this kind of rich, seemingly bourgeois guy who invested money sort of from the shadows. He was distrusted by the Republicans because he was a little too much of an anarchist. He fell between all these cracks, and when push came to shove, no one was sure they could really trust him. Nevertheless, he gets arrested, he gets tried, he gets sentenced, he gets executed in Montjuic Castle in 1909. What's interesting, though, is not just that story, even though I do think that's an interesting story, but what it creates. So it creates a mass protest movement that was probably the strongest in France, Italy, Belgium, and Latin America. One thing that those countries have is generally the connection between Catholicism and radicalism. So the anti-Catholic sentiment was an important part of it. But it was also strong in some Protestant countries where a different kind of anti-Catholic sentiment influenced the protests. But in some cases, it turned into riots. In some cases, the night of his execution in Paris, there was a riot where actually a police officer was fatally shot. There was mass property destruction, and it got really intense. Mass protest movement leads to the creation of a different kind of way to protest his execution, which is the modern school movement. So more or less Ferrerian schools were opened around North and South America, Europe, and elsewhere. But what's interesting is that people generally had very little information to go off of to be able to figure out what a Ferrer school would be. Some people had access to the book that he wrote in 1908, although, as I mentioned, that book didn't necessarily reflect the school he created all that much. But some people didn't even have that. So the schools varied quite a bit in terms of how lax or disciplinarian they were and what kind of content they taught. So, for example, in New York, shortly after Ferrer dies, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and some other key figures start, I think it was called the Ferrer Association. They create a school, but the school is forced to relocate to New Jersey. Why? Because Alexander Berkman was involved in a plot to blow up one of the Rockefellers that went awry. His fellow conspirators blew themselves up in a house or a building in Manhattan. He was not blown up. He continued to live. Some of the other folks died. And so because of the repression that came about, they moved the school out to Stelton, New Jersey, right near Rutgers, where it existed from about, I think, 1914, I think until the early 50s. Long time. And if you read accounts and speak to the people, speaking of which, in New Jersey every year there's a meeting of the Friends of the Modern School, including a lot of the students who were there, and I've met a bunch of them. That school was far more open-ended, and some of the students didn't even formally start to learn reading until they decided they wanted to learn how to read. It was very much the opposite of Ferrer's school, where, for example, they had grammar lessons where the teacher would go around correcting how they said things. It was very different. But as you can see, people took it up and made it their own. The country, though, that probably had the most significant modern school movement was actually Spain. Because what happened was, and this is of interest for those of you who are interested in the Spanish Civil War era, is that the anarcho-syndicalist CNT essentially adopted Ferrer's pedagogical vision for their working class schools. And so, especially in the 30s, a lot of the anarchists of the Spanish Civil War were educated in Ferrer's schools. And their vision of it was probably closer to what Ferrer did than some of the other places. So, what to take from all this? In conclusion, I try, as you can tell, not to sugarcoat who Ferrer was or what his school was, not only because that's bad history, but because it's far less interesting if you read some of the accounts written 50 years ago that either portray Ferrer as a villain who taught his students how to make bombs, which he did not do. He might have someday, under certain circumstances, had the social revolution been near, but he didn't get there. And it's also not as interesting if you believe his own rhetoric about himself, that he was only interested in the truth and had no interest in politics. He was a much more interesting character than that. And so in the book I have several biographical essays about him, essays he wrote both as his formal teacher self and also essays he wrote as his secret subversive self. I also include essays that were written by other anarchists of the time that were very critical of Ferrer, mostly from the angle of critiquing his focus on content rather than method of teaching. So some anarchists at the time said, there should be no such thing as anarchist education. There should only be education where the student follows the conclusions of the material to their own logical conclusion. So those are two really interesting extremes. On the one hand, you have Ferrer, who said, there is truth, we can find it through science and reason, it leads to anarchism, case closed, let's just teach that. And on the other end, you have people who are so reticent to indoctrinate that they essentially argue that we should just provide students with sort of a space to figure it out and let them figure it out. Now, Ferrer's response would have been, okay, if you do that in Catholic Spain, what do you think the result's going to be? Right? He would have argued the result would have been most people in most circumstances, if you leave them to figure it out on their own, are simply going to replicate the society they live in. And of course, the response to that would be, you are indoctrinating people. He actually responded to one of those accusations in a personal correspondence where he said, so what, I don't care, I'm right. So anyway, these conversations, which are very, I think, stimulating and interesting, are in that book. Ferrer's Modern School book is in there, and also writings about Ferrer from Emma Goldman, Rudolf Rocker, Alexander Berkman, all the various people that knew him. Also, I co-edited it with a professor of education named Rob Hayworth. He's got a neat book on PM Press called Out of the Ruins about anarchists and alternative pedagogy, and he wrote an essay about sort of moving forward from here. There's a lot on the table there. I feel like I've been talking too much, so I look forward to your comments and questions and so forth.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm just curious whether there are tie-ins with the progressive aspects in the arts. I mean, you have Spanish painters who, Picasso, Miro, left Spain, they found it intolerable, went to France. Were there connections? Were there knowledge of each other?
Yeah, so at the time that he was around, there was what was known as the Generation of 98, which were essentially artists and intellectuals who very strongly dabbled with ideas surrounding anarchism, and he had some of those figures writing for his newspaper, giving Sunday lectures at his school, and sometimes using some of their books. There was an interesting kind of flirtation there. Some of them walked away thinking that he was essentially too much of a doctrinaire radical. So they had sort of some of the critiques about leaving education more open-ended. Picasso, I don't think when he was in Barcelona had anything directly to do with these folks. I think he was sort of in his own circle, as far as I know, although I'm not a Picasso expert. There was some tie-in and some overlap, but I think there was generally a lot of distrust from the workers' movement with some of the intellectuals and artists. Ferrer was interesting, sort of in the middle, but he wasn't too interested in courting artists. He had much more of a kind of mechanistic understanding of truth. Yeah. Yeah.
What got you interested in this subject at this point in history?
Yeah, well, when I was in college, I got interested in the Spanish Civil War and the Spanish Revolution, and all the fascinating politics that happened there, which led me to be interested in, for my PhD, studying Spanish history, But over time, I became more and more interested in the decades that led up to it than the war itself. And there's so little in English about this stuff that it's interesting, although the basic points are very well documented in Spanish language literature and French language literature. And also, I just think that Ferrer is an interesting figure because he was an anarchist, but he kind of wasn't. He was a Republican, but kind of wasn't. He was sort of an educational figure, he kind of wasn't. He was kind of a working class figure, he kind of wasn't. He was kind of rich, but he gave away most of his money, but he also kind of didn't. And so I just think that's more the norm in history. Most people are more like that, and we tend to put political movements and figures into boxes, but it's always much more messy than that. So there we are. Yeah.
So you talked about the school starting out in really sort of autocratic kind of ways when it emerged.
Based on our perspective now, I'm sure compared to the Catholic Church schools at the time, it's still probably, my sense was, relatively free. It's all, a matter of perspective, but yeah.
But then you talked about how it evolved.
Mm-hmm.
What were the influences there? And was that Ferrer, or were there other educators there?
There were other educators there. One of them was a woman named Clemencia Jacquinet, who was also an anarchist educator, but was more of the school of not sort of creating a rigid sense of what the content should be. She was more of the kind of form rather than content end of the spectrum. And she seems to have been a big influence, and I include some of the correspondence that she and Ferrer had debating some of these issues. She quit after, I think, a year or a year and a half because she thought the school had betrayed the mission that she wanted for it. There was a school newspaper, which I include a bunch of articles from the school newspaper. You'd imagine a school newspaper would be like, here's what the students are doing and here's what the teachers are doing. This is a school. None of that. It was basically an educational theoretical journal. So it has more articles like stuff written by like Rousseau than it does have stuff about what the students were actually doing. And it has very little information about who the faculty were. So that is kind of frustrating that there's a limit to how much I know or can be known about that. But Ferrer doesn't seem to have been a classroom teacher. He was someone who organized the school, arranged the money, the teachers taught. He was like a big ideas guy, right? And for being an anarchist, he seemed very disinterested in delegating power. He was making the decisions. So I'm sure that the changes that occurred because of this interaction with the faculty, his own thinking on the matter, him talking to other people, and probably just a sense of trial and error. But it's hard to know definitively, unfortunately. Yeah?
I'm curious to know if he had any writings or thoughts that you know of on women's rights or women's place in the revolution and
Great.
the anarchist revolution, because the personal relationships you're describing seem rather misogynistic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So two things. I'll list the good before the bad. He was very involved in, and this, believe me, this will end up being good. It sounds bad in the beginning. He was involved in what was called the Neo-Malthusian movement, which starters sounds like a bad movement. But what essentially, they unfortunately used this term to describe what was essentially the birth control movement, the movement to empower working class women to have access to birth control and to make their own decisions about reproduction. So in that sense, he was interested in empowering women, especially working class women. He believed in co-education for boys and girls, which was a bit ahead of its time in Spain. But he's been given a little too much credit for that, because if you actually read, and in the Modern School book, he describes the reason why he thinks it's important for little girls to be educated is because someday they will grow up to be mothers of boys, and if they are not educated properly, they will get their ideas from the church, and they will then give those ideas to their sons. So, if you want to have revolutionary sons, they need revolutionary mothers, they need to be taught as girls to be revolutionary. So, in a certain sense, you could say it might be kind of a first wave feminist notion of, yes, women are not garbage, but ... But beyond that, he wasn't good on gender, no. And he wasn't exceptional among any kind of political faction for the time in that regard, really. That was more the norm than the exception, unfortunately. But yeah, not good. And his relationships with women were not good either. He had 3 partners that we know of. You heard about the first one. The second one that he was with was a woman named Leopoldine Bonnard, who was a teacher at the modern school. They had 1 son, but after a few years, they separated, and he started dating a different teacher at the modern school. He didn't have any children with the last woman he was with, but he stayed with her until his death. And then, of course, it raises the issue of his relationship with his children, which he didn't have much of a relationship with. And it raises the question of, was Ferrer a good father? If you read the writings of his daughters, they adamantly affirm that he was, but of course they're writing it under duress when the whole world thinks their father is evil. It's hard to say, but these are, questions to consider. Yep. Yeah.
So what are the offshoots from the 50s, 60s, 70s onward that came from the modern school after the modern school closed? But what kind of took its place and maybe took the tradition and legacy of that on in those days?
It doesn't seem... So here's where the co-edited by comes in, because my co-editor, Bob Hayworth, who lives in Pennsylvania, if he were here, could answer that question better, because he's an education guy. I come to this more from the radical history angle. But it seems to me that, directly speaking, in most of the world, after the mid-20th century, Ferrer's specific legacy doesn't become a major influence for experiments in radical pedagogy moving forward. That comes from other kinds of sources like Paulo Freire and Montessori schools and other kinds of ideas. Probably an exception would be Spain, but even so, I'm not fully clear on that, and with Franco being in power, then I'm not sure too many experiments like that happened. And now, some of the reasons for that are obvious, like there's some serious flaws in this stuff. But also, I think that it had something to do with just a real disconnect between the radicalism of the first half of the century and the second half of the century. The context changed, the influence changed, and so forth. So, yeah.
I can address that also. I
Sure.
wrote a book about the free school movement of the 60s, and what you said is true. Their influence was not directly from Ferrer. I think a couple of the figures in that movement might have come across him, but it was not a major influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
What were the influences?
The Deweyan tradition, and then A.S. Neal, John Holt. It was a lot out of their own experience. They didn't read a lot of educational theory, and it was more of a response to the times, the demand for freedom in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So I was struck by the fact that the CNT adopted Ferrer's model for their schools.
Yeah.
And so I was
With a
wondering-
few notable changes, but yeah.
So I was wondering what happened after 39 and Franco in power, that the CNT goes underground and
Yeah.
then they moved to France, and
Yeah.
there's some cells in Mexico. Do they also employ like the Ferrer model in France? I guess I'm asking if that basically gave the modern school another push to like become this broader
Yeah.
international phenomenon.
Right. Well, certainly the Senatistas that are exiled in France are initially largely kept in concentration camps by the French authorities for a while. When they get out, not long after the Nazis invade, so a lot of them are involved in the resistance to fight back the Nazis. That lasts till 45. Before you know it, a decade's gone by. The movement, if I remember correctly, the CNT kind of splits a few times. There's a lot of infighting. They're kind of, culturally, linguistically on the outside, looking in French society. So, to my knowledge, there isn't really much. But one thing you mentioned has relevance. In the introduction, I talk about how back in 2011 I was in Paris, and I went to visit the offices of one of the CNTs in France, which was created based on the Spanish model. And the CNT, again, for those who don't know, was Spanish Anarchist Union. And I go in and I find all of these Spaniards who had fled from Spain in the late 30s, and most of them as children, a few of them as teenagers. And so I just had this lovely afternoon chatting with them about their experiences. And at the end of it, when I was ready to go, they got up and gave me this postcard of Francisco Ferrer with his biography in the back and said, "Please learn about this important person." And so what I took away from that is basically they were saying, like, yeah, you're going to forget all of our personal anecdotes, but like this is what we see as our legacy. So that struck me, and I wrote about it in the intro, and it gives you some sense of really how the movements of this era, for the most part, thought of social transformation as multifaceted with kind of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And the long-term goal was to essentially make a world where people would be educated in such a way where they wouldn't need to put each other in cages or beat each other to have a sociable society. And that's also reflected in the fact that during the Spanish Revolution, the anarchist movement at first didn't allow its, what were called as the anarchist youth, didn't allow them to fight in the revolution because they wanted one generation untainted by war and killing that could survive for after the war. As things got bad, they jettisoned that. But it gives you some sense of how they saw youth, education, and social transformation. Yeah?
So how do you see this relating to the kind of radical American history of the occupiers?
Yeah, of stuff more recently, yeah. I think the question of education and social transformation is an interesting question. On the one hand, I am an educator, and I think education has a profound ability to transform lives and society. On the other hand, I don't think that it or anything else can do it on its own. And I think that most radicals are rightly skeptical of the notion that you can just sort of tell someone or teach something without reference to how power is constructed in larger society, how social movements operate, all the different economic and social factors that tie into who we are and what we do. So I think people should check out this book almost as kind of a mirror to see how things have changed and to think about education and propaganda, for example. Now, propaganda, I use the word propaganda in the early 20th century sense of information intended to convince someone of something. Today it's basically thought of as synonymous as fake news, but I like the notion of propaganda as something you're trying to convince someone of something. And one of the interesting articles in the book was written by this Spanish anarchist who argued that propagandizing to adults is very different from teaching children, and they shouldn't be done the same way or thought of the same way. And I think that's another interesting conversation about what is the role of popular education in social struggles. What kind of information should we be providing to people that we want to convince otherwise? And to what extent is social transformation based on convincing people versus building power and creating social circumstances where people will change on their own? I don't have answers to these things. That's sort of just talking in circles, but those are things that it makes me think of.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks. Yeah.